Hi, everybody. Welcome to another show. And in today's show, we're going to be interviewing two folks. We're dealing with Rich and Clayton. These guys are the author of this book. I'll put a quick QR code on the screen so that everybody can see it and understand what it is that we're talking about. And then we'll provide this code to you again at the end of the show. The actual book is called Generative Artificial Intelligence Revealed. And the book really delves into the world of generative AI, which is a topic near and dear to Sean and I's heart. We talk a lot about that. It seems week in and week out because everybody's looking to figure out how can they leverage it? How can they implement it? Is it a fad? Is it going to pop? Where's it going to be in the future? What's the future state look like? Et cetera, et cetera. And so with that being said, let's jump into a conversation. And Rich, if you don't mind me asking, talk to the audience a little bit about the book. Let us know some of the inspiration behind it and kind of the history.
Yeah, thank you. The history, the full context, I guess, actually began with another book called Doing AI, which I wrote in December, maybe 2021. And Clayton was an unfortunate reader, though he sent me a really positive message on LinkedIn. And
it's a great book.
Thank you. And so he slid into my DMs, I guess is what the kids say. And so we started talking about technology, and his background is law, so he was coming at it from the perspective of like the I guess the legal and kind of like ethical considerations of AI adoption. I was more from a technical perspective, and ChatGPT dropped or was released, and I guess that was November of 2022, maybe.
Oh.
And that really sort of accelerated, I guess, our conversations, mainly because, the technology was so compelling. I guess first and foremost, the user adoption was meteoric, and then on top of that, the algorithms were trained from the internet. So from a legal perspective, that presented some interesting hurdles or obstacles, or at least sort of discussions. And after a couple of months of going back and forth, kind of wrestling with the technology, what it was, what it wasn't, we decided to write an article that quickly became a very large, bloated article of maybe, 10,000 words. And so we decided to kind of like codify, I guess, our observations in a book. And actually the screen capture that you shared with the QR code is reference to that book, which was released last summer, maybe June or July, so a little over a year ago. That was kind of like our, at the time, narrow understanding of the technology, and it so I our narrow interpretation of the technology and kind of what was happening. And so it was kind of a lighter treatment, I guess. It was only about 20,000, maybe 25,000 words. We continued to work on the book after it was released, and then we decided to sort of like really invest our time and energy into a comprehensive treatment of the topic. And that was maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and now we have finished. The book is in pre-press. It is actually called Generative Technology Revealed, with a very lengthy subtitle. What is that subtitle? It's a great question. I think
the peer group drove a lot of words to the subtitle.
Well, yeah, we were aiming on SEO, but the subtitle is Understanding AI from Technical Depth to Business Insight to Responsible Adoption. That book will be available in the next maybe week or two, and I think we have maybe a link to that book website. The book will be available on Amazon as well, paperback, hard copy, audio, etc. But the ebook version is going to be available for free, which is hopefully compelling to your audience.
No, this is great. The one thing that's funny, and this I think applies to everybody listening to the show. We go to bed as AI experts and we wake up as novices. So it's changing that fast. And so it's no wonder why as soon as you write something into the book, you're like, oh, snap, we forgot about this, or this this just changed. This is now irrelevant. It's really literally changing.
There's definitely an aspect of that. And I think we're battling with that to some degree. And we certainly heard a lot of people like, why would you even write a book about something that was changing so quickly? However, our strategy was to find kind of like these really systemic or congenital type of things, aspects, problems, deficiencies, limitations with the technology from a technical perspective. So like these strange technological artifacts, as well as from like the legal and regulatory perspective. And so we were looking for concepts that were going to persist, that were like important to understand, because it informed like a reader's comprehension of what was happening, but also something that wasn't going to necessarily change. It's hard to walk that line. And certainly, we had to talk about some things that we know have a half-life that is pretty rapid, but other aspects of it really held up. Even from the book we wrote last summer to this version, like we really emphasized scaling laws, the tendency of language models to memorize, like that stuff's not going away.
No,
and so
that's the biggest problem we're trying to solve today, for sure.
Yeah. So,
I mean, what has you seen that surprised you? How persistent, from a challenges perspective in Gen AI? So, there's some things that you guessed and guessed correctly. Is there any that you guessed wouldn't persist and has? I know for me, RAG, right? I thought RAG, someone would be able to advance it far forward than what everybody initially came with, but it has certainly been the gold standard when it comes to adding data to generative AI. And it's very surprising to me. I thought there would be a lot more growth and different competing ideas, but really it's been right down the fairway with RAG.
Yeah, well, the infinite context windows are maybe the challenge to RAG at this point, or even like those exceedingly large context windows. I think Google has 1 million, and I think some other people are tinkering with infinite context windows. That might be the thing that challenges RAG ultimately, but RAG is interesting, I think, from another perspective, which is there's a lot of criticism. I don't know if you've recently followed some of the discussions about like where's the beef kind of questions, like where's the revenue. Sequoia's asked this question. I think Goldman effectively asked this question, and I think RAG kind of illustrates why maybe the technology's adoption or even its ability to generate revenue has been somewhat slow, is because the technology first and foremost is kind of raw. Like ChatGPT isn't exactly a product. It was kind of thrown out there in this very raw way, and people were excited about it and started tinkering with it to figure out adoption. But what they soon realized was, well, we need a bunch of complementary technologies to help kind of like productize the technology, one of which was RAG. Like RAG didn't even exist before. I mean, some of the underlying technology of like looking at vector similarity and stuff was there, but pure RAG systems didn't exist. It's just an example of like, before we could figure out what this technology is or what kind of potential it has, I think we're going to find that it needs a bunch of complementary technologies. Prompt chaining is one, prompt templates is another, advanced prompting techniques, like all those things are just being discovered. So it's a good question though. I don't know if Clayton had anything to add, but
I don't think I do on that point. I think it is worth mentioning that going back even to the work you did in doing AI was this sort of challenge that we're approaching these problems kind of the wrong way. And all of our excitement with this new technology and what we may or may not be able to do with it, we fundamentally lost focus on the purpose, right? Which is, which problems are we trying to solve? And then looking at these models maybe more as tools, right? Is this the right product? Is this the right way to approach solving these problems? And I think that theme carried through to our book, and you guys were sort of mentioning, the way I look at this project, the book is a project and it's ongoing and living and breathing because it changes so fast and so quickly. But I do think it's important just to remember how fast all of this stuff is changing. Use cases, technologies, even on the regulatory side is changing daily. So it's a crazy world. So not directly on point to what you were just talking about, Rich, but I do think it's kind of worth
It's related.
framing what this this kind of project has been.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, the key thing that I think most business leaders are failing at is understanding the art of the possible.
Yeah.
And understanding what kind of value to time curves are available. Those are the two challenges that I see regularly from the people I talk to. I get, number one, hey, does this stuff actually work? Still, 2024, does this work? Number two, well, can you actually do anything with it? Here are the two things that, and I think your book is really good in educating people these problems. And I know, to your point, Rich, 2022, it came out. Here we are 2 years later, and there's still so much myth and legend when it comes to this technology, where, as I remember, like, when was Google Transformers made? Like, so as any technology, it evolves, and you're looking at 20, 30 years of AI theory coming into reality, and there's a lot more to unpack. And to your point, Rich, I don't think it's going to be like, this is what the technology is going to change. It's going to be the layering of other technologies, which is exactly how GPT really came on the scenes. It was built on the shoulder of giants.
Yeah. You're almost talking about a kind of like Heisenberg principle of uncertainty to some degree. Like, a lot of people get locked into what is happening right now, and like, what is the technology doing? And like the harder we look at that, the harder it is to also understand momentum, right? Like, if you're trying to identify the position of something, you don't really understand the momentum. Conversely, if you're looking at the momentum, you don't know where you are at any one point. And I think that's kind of a tension that businesses specifically, are trying to reconcile. They're looking at the technology and they're like, okay, well, it could do this. And they kind of miss, I think, maybe some of the momentum, that the technology is changing pretty rapidly. And so I think when organizations are thinking about the adoption of the technology, I think right now, organizations should think about long-term positioning. They should be thinking about what use cases they might find value from today, but not over-invest in the technology, because I think they run the risk of creating maybe like vendor lock-in to some degree. Like, if you go all in on your chips today, you miss out on the momentum, which is like, you would, if you, like, Bloomberg adopted the technology, they wrote a really fantastic paper. I think it was December of 2022, they adopted GPT-3, or maybe it was early 2023, and they spent $1.5 million to train their own model on their own data. Now, a lot of businesses aren't going to have their own data to even train enough data, at least, to train their own models. But they missed out on GPT-4. They missed out on infinite context windows. Like, think about all the technology they missed out, because they're like, this, we understand the deficiencies in the technology today. We were looking at position, kind of like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. What they missed was, it's actually changing really fast. And maybe they would have been better off from a strategy perspective, an adoption perspective, if they had, like, kind of, taken the foot off the pedal a little bit, and then just worked on kind of like general purpose technologies or adoption strategies, just to some degree.
Well, one quick thing, we have our messages open, so anybody who wants to put in for a question for Rich and Clayton, or even me, please put it in here. One of the questions that someone put in was around when it comes to adoption, should technology or ROI be the focus on adoption? So right to your point, Rich.
Yeah.
So to me, I might even, sorry, Rich, go ahead.
No, Clayton, please.
I was going to say, I would even, foundationally, again, this is what we always have to challenge ourselves, is make it problem centric. So something I'll tell organizations is kind of treat your AI programs like you would a startup, which means you really have to be clear on your vision, mission, and core values, so that from your boards of directors through your executives all the way down through the rank and file, what purpose you're striving towards, so that when new technologies come online, you can evaluate what's the best approach. Is it consistent with where we're trying to go? And then same with the risks, right? You're looking at all these risks that are emerging daily and changing just as rapidly as the technology. And you can start to analyze, can we pivot so that we're still consistent with our vision, what we're trying to accomplish, yet reduce some of the emerging risks and maybe approach it a different way. So I think that's important. So I guess in answering your question, I would say not technology, but I would try to beat problem-centric focus into the culture as much as you can.
Have that North Star. David?
Yeah, I got a question for Clayton. So I spent 10 years, 16 years-ish, and somewhere in the middle, varying degrees, in legal, working for some of the big AmLaw firms, and in technology, not as a lawyer. But you have an interesting perspective as a lawyer. And I think a lot of our viewers, especially leadership, is suffering, not all, but some are suffering from analysis by paralysis. They're on the sidelines, they're waiting. There's an unknown HR component to this, which we won't dig into on this conversation, but just as a call out, most employees are afraid that AI could take their job. You hear this in the news and the media, but there's this other component that's happening that leadership needs to be aware of. And that is that if they continue with analysis by paralysis, because the workforce is scared, if the organization they work for is not adopting AI, they're going to feel like their company's stagnant. They know they're falling behind in the skill set. They're going to look to jump ship to go to another company that is embracing it. So to that point, what are some of the, because I have a feeling the analysis by paralysis could be, I don't want to get sued. I don't want to get in trouble.
Yeah.
So can you talk from the perspective or paradigm about some of the legal challenges that may be running through leadership mind and the things they definitely should be concerned about and some of the things that they're just scaring themselves? It's okay to fail often, and the legal issue isn't so much of an issue, or it could be, but just do this to cover your bases. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, great topics, right? And I think
Great question.
So you've got, what Rich said, I agree with, right? Which maybe being intentional and slowing down a little bit is a good thing so that you can analyze and keep up with tech. On the other end of that spectrum, right? Or if you keep going, are we paralyzed? Are we not moving? Do our investors get concerned? Do our employees get concerned because we're not innovative? And frankly, let's be honest, most employees want to play with this stuff. It's cool, it's new, it's innovative. They can be more efficient. I think your point on, so one of the things Rich and I do in our book is try and kind of establish a landscape of generative AI risks. One of those that we discuss is employee replacement, employee concerns. And I think that's why I keep going back to this idea of vision, mission, core values. And then what I would append to that or add to that is communication. So one of the things that we talk about is have those conversations. What are we trying to do with our technology? Will it be perceived as a risk to our employees? And if it is, let's be open and communicate with them so that they're part of that conversation. Yep. And then ultimately, if we make the decision, a business decision, which is a hard one to make, that it is so important for our business and investors to address that risk, knowing that there will be some employee reduction, then you, at least you have eyes wide open and you can try and retrain people or help them find new positions, so you're aware of it. So more to the point on legal and regulatory risk. So what we know, right, is that it's changing daily. California, just in their last session, I think just brought 4 AI specific laws that all passed. Now we'll see which of those Governor Newsom signs or whether he uses his veto. In particular, 1047, which is a pretty robust AI regulatory approach, which has been all over the news, has caused a lot of controversy. But what we try to do in the book, and my advice would be, understand the commonalities between all of these various laws and regulations, and then even common law. What's going on? What's being challenged, in the courts, and what issue, mainly copyright issues and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Try to get a baseline of what those risks are, and then establish a framework for one, does it cross a threshold where we just think it's too risky, right? We want to know, we have some IP, we want to use an AI to help us build and create. Can we protect it? And if we deem that we can't, is it worth pursuing? So really understanding where are those deep pitfalls that really might be detrimental to the business. But then beyond that, what commonalities exist? Well, most of these laws are in some way focused on harms to individuals or to humans. So what can we do to protect against those, to be prepared for them? And there's a host of things you can do. And we can get into some of those, but I think that's kind of I'll just pause there because I've been going on for a minute.
So another legal perspective question for you. Coming from the larger law firms, and this is applicable to anybody that's watching the show or listening in the future, from a Fortune 100 or Fortune 500 company. They all have these pretty significant legal departments of substantive size to some extent. Tools of the trade, Lois Law, LexisNexis, all these research tools. AI is fantastic at this stuff. Is there anything that legal departments should be keeping their eye on with generative AI capabilities that can span all of these research tools of case law to help them mitigate to the points that you just made earlier, to help them do that research quicker, to get those answers that they need faster? So I can just imagine as an attorney, that would be like absolutely a quick win, and also be able to give this up to the C-suite team to help provide advice to them as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So legal tech obviously is one of the hot button issues for AI for the reasons you just mentioned. It's very good at searching, navigating, summarizing information. There, of course, were sort of the early gotchas where ChatGPT and other models were used to come up with legal theories and find precedent to support those theories. And as Rich can get into more, these models are very good at answering your questions, but it doesn't mean that they're right or they're based in fact. And so in those cases that I'm referring to, they just fictionalized lawsuits and case law to support specific positions that were then submitted to the courts. And of course, that's a major ethical violation and caused all kinds of problems. So there was a little hesitancy there. As far as specific tools, I don't practice daily on the legal side anymore, but I know there's a ton of good resources out there, and I could probably get some in the show notes for what my friends and colleagues have found helpful. But it's certainly there, and it's changing the practice for sure.
I'm so far removed from it. 10 years now. I have no clue. Figured it was a good question to ask for sure.
But I do. So I guess one specific example that we did do with some success was we were able to create some models in support of analyzing all of the legal agreements that you have with your clients, your customers, and your business partners to pull out key legal provisions, whether they be cybersecurity provisions, insurance provisions, stuff of that sort, which again is just an incredible time saver and a good check, because as time goes on, of course, you've got 6,000 addendums to each client agreement. What has been added as it relates to data privacy obligations, what has been added as it relates to security, so on and so forth. So I think there's a bunch of those really good use cases where the technology has proved game changing without overstating it.
Question for either one of you. Unlikely pairing for the book as authors. Talk a little bit about how you guys met and came together to write this book.
Yeah, unlikely pairing in a number of ways. So and we laugh about it a lot, but
because there's this juxtaposition of don't do that, and they're like, yeah, I want to innovate. So
well, and I do think I will say my legal approach has always been as a business enabler. So oftentimes I think our role isn't to say no, but is to figure out how to say yes. So
nice.
That's kind of my legal worldview. But with Rich, it really was. I just reached out. I liked that he was challenging the overlooking, if you will, of finding real business problems to solve with AI. At the time I was with the company, we were spinning up AI prototypes pretty regularly, and they all went the same way, right? You'd have a meeting, you'd do the wow factor. Everyone was like, oh, this is game changing. It's incredible. And then it would fizzle and die because there wasn't a real problem behind it. So I reached out, told him I liked his book, and I said, hey, have you thought about AI regulatory risks and how it might impact the industry? And I think the first answer was just no, period. And I was like, oh no, this isn't going to go well. But then upon reflection, it kicked off a conversation that's still going on. So thanks, Rich, for indulging us.
That's excellent. I mean, I guess I lean more into Rich's domain, but I'll tell you, for the two of you, I'd really like to know, one of the common questions that I get is, as a business leader in IT trying to digitally transform my business, my enterprise, the company I work for, how do I have a rational, sane conversation between the two different worlds? The CISO who says, like Clayton, hey, we've got regulatory, we've got cybersecurity insurance that we've got to follow. And then the business leaders who are like, look, Joe Schmo down the street is using this and they're able to drop their costs by 30%, and we can't, and we've got margin to make. How do you have that rational conversation? I'll let both of you guys respond to that one, because I know it's got to be a juicy one. Clayton, you want to go first?
Oh, I'm going first. Okay. So I don't want to keep hitting the point, but there exists a huge competitive advantage opportunity, I believe, for organizations that are intentional about how and if and when they use these technologies. And so I think if you put the right team together, and by right team, I mean neurodiversity, you want the naysayers, you want the sales folks who just want the new thing to go sell, you want everybody there. But the tricky part is, right, you have to have the quarterback. You have to have the leader who can put all of this on the table and keep all of these input from all these important points of view together, because this technology cuts across the entire organization. It just does. Everyone has to be involved. So I think in approaching those conversations, you establish the North Star. You say, here are some examples of ways other organizations have effectively used these technologies. Do we see any applications here? And if so, then you really spin up a responsible AI program, if you will. And it wrestles with this stuff at the outset to establish what you're going to do and how. And then on an ongoing basis, you continue to have this group who's always looking at it and analyzing all the various factors. So that would be my initial response.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, we're an odd pairing, to be sure. However, I think we both look at non-adoption, I guess, as a risk factor as well. And so it's not just legal and regulatory risk or even ethical concerns that organizations need to be worried about. It's not adopting the technology too. And so there is kind of this analysis paralysis, and it's not even just limited to like the ethical, legal, regulatory kind of considerations. Those are more substantive than any others. Like, I've even met people who have kind of these existential fears, kind of like adopting the AI doomer kind of viewpoint of the technology. And while I think those perspectives are unhinged, some people are worried about them. And so regardless of like what you're factoring into your decision making, part of that decision making should be not making a decision. And that's a risk in and of itself. And so, I think where we meet, Clayton and I, is that we do want to see organizations adopt the technology and to be innovative. And it's just, how do you do that is the question. And you have to figure out what problems you want to solve first. I think earlier we had a question about return on investment. I think return on investment should certainly be part of the discussion. It's a material and kind of like substantive concern for businesses. However, it shouldn't dominate the conversation either, because you want to be kind of prospecting, you want to be experimental. Maybe you don't know exactly what use cases are going to provide ROI. And it's kind of an indirect consequence of the technology. The technology is so general, it's really hard to identify, well, what use cases are going to be the most material use cases for the technology. But two, like, I think even working with the technology, I've spent a lot of time over the last year and a half working directly with the technology, and it works in like very counterintuitive ways. Like some things it does really well, like it could write code to run a web app to play tic-tac-toe in the browser, but it can't play tic-tac-toe. And so, you know, it from a human perspective, it's counterintuitive. Like the things we tend to project kind of like these anthropomorphic standards on the technology. When we see it do something exceptional, we assume that like a human, it could probably also do other things exceptionally well. And the technology doesn't work like that. And so that's why I'm saying experimentation is really important, but also back to that idea of like position and momentum. The technology is moving so fast. So you want to experiment with the technology, but you don't want to overinvest in the technology either and kind of like compromise maybe your long-term adoption strategy. And so it's a very like nuanced discussion ultimately about AI adoption. And, you know, I think that's what we were wrestling with in the book. And one final point that Clayton makes about adoption, AI adoption, is really going to be, it's going to require the involvement of a lot of people. I think at its core, we struggled when writing the book of like, who is this book for? And it's really not, it's written for businesses, but it's not written necessarily for anyone in a business. Although there are like, there's a chapter dedicated to legal, so lawyers are going to perhaps find that specific chapter more salient than others. I obviously spend a lot of time talking about the technology, so maybe technology leaders or analytical leaders are going to appreciate that. But really, the book is kind of a holistic. I think should be interpreted holistically, and it really is written for almost everybody, because everybody in an organization is going to have to, I think, understand to some sufficient degree these all of these kind of wrinkles in adoption.
So going back to that earlier question or point that people have analysis by paralysis, I think it's also because companies are trying to potentially boil the ocean with this thing, and they're not very intent specific driven on that. So to that end, or to that point, what is your thought around approaching anybody that has a question, like where do I begin? What do I do? And all this other stuff. Sometimes it's easier to invert the question by saying, what isn't AI? Like, what is this not good for, as opposed to what is it good for? Because those possibilities potentially are smaller than the possibilities of what can. Like in your experience, and even Clayton from the legal perspective, what are some just bad use cases for AI that you guys have run across?
That's a great question, David. And often when I think about it, I frame it as what is a bad use case for us or for that specific business. And what I mean by that is, if you look at, let's take the risk of what I generally call the goodwill risk, right? How could I damage my brand by some use case of AI? And there's a lot of examples of this, but if you're a company that employs a lot of creatives, let's say somebody like an Adobe, and you are going to start creating models that replace core creators, you might have put the technology aside and whether it's more efficient and can create stuff faster and better than what you currently have. Am I going to upset my entire user base? And then you're talking about potentially boycotts and other sorts of bad things. So I think you have to sort of be intentional, and from your vantage point, what are good and bad use cases? I do think, you know, and it's gotten better, but in that legal context, that's a bad use case, right? It was creating precedent. So, and they're not always intuitive. That's the tricky part. So you brought up, I think, HR, which we don't have to get too deep into, but there are some laws on the books, and a lot of people focused on, are we unintentionally creating bias in our hiring and candidate processes by using these technologies? So those are just some that come to mind.
Nice. So maybe framing something this way too as well. And I think, Sean, you can attest to this. We've talked to this about on a couple of our shows, is that rather than boil the ocean, one of the quick wins, and Clayton, you tell me whether or not you agree with this approach or statement too as well. So from Rich, a standpoint of taking this technology and not trying to do a whole bunch of it, but looking at, I don't know, pick a department, find a workflow that's impactful, inject into one of the blocks of the workflow, ask the question, can AI make this more efficient? And if so, that's a low-hanging piece of fruit. Insert AI here. And rinse and repeat. Small, little successive wins. People get the confidence. Management gets the confidence because it's inside the walls. And I'm going to caveat and disclaim that workflow has nothing to do, no breach, no data's leaving. There's no interactive with customers. So it's all inside the walls, inside the business, and may not even directly touch an employee to where they know that it's there, but it's part of the process. It's part of the workflow. So from a legal standpoint, I would think it would be very protective, but at the same token, it's small enough to iterate on. It's small enough to find the low-hanging fruit. And it's also potentially has a huge win of rinse and repeat, that type of methodology. And if companies focus and start there, they might realize a little bit more success sooner rather than later. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great approach. I think it's very similar to how I would recommend doing it. And perhaps the only thing maybe you could add to it is some kind of more robust training program as to what this technology is and how it works, so that business leaders across the organization can start to think about their problems and analyze whether they have good use cases that they may volunteer. I still, and I hate to slow it down too much, but I still like the idea of having some kind of central nerve system or group that's processing all these disparate use cases, so that you don't accidentally find yourself, you start dabbling with it, and then all of a sudden you say, well, wait, we can do it just as easily with these external data, and we can do this. And then you might hit a threshold where you have real risk that are worth, noting and mitigating. But I think that's a great approach.
Nice.
Yeah. I mean, I see it as, there are very large common use cases like knowledge base. You can't get more Gen AI, 101 as, hey, a knowledge base, right? Then you get into very vertical specific ones, like your legal research assistant, right? And again, it's in the industry, but it's not individual. My personal view and perspective is the real value is the third use case, which is your specific business and the pain that you're experiencing, right? I think you can get much more value at that more intimate level than going to, hey, the industry or, the tech world in general is saying. But I think a lot of people want to skip over, Clayton, your recommendation of let's think about this intentionally. I'm afraid people are being given a budget to go invest in Gen AI. And as Rich said at the very beginning, they're now getting asked, where's the beef, right? Where's this value? So, if they weren't doing it intentionally and they've made some investments, they may very well run into challenges justifying a lot of the hype spend, as I like to tell it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Rich, we had a show called The AI Bubble a couple of weeks ago that Sean and I did. And I noticed that in the book, there's like a segment that you talk about the future of generative AI. Based on what you're seeing with a lot of information coming at you from a fire hose or drinking from the fire hose, so to speak, look into your crystal ball and kind of tell folks watching today's podcast, like, what are some of your perspectives? Where do you see the future? What does that entail?
Oh boy.
It doesn't mean you have to be right or wrong. It's a crystal ball, and the crystal ball might be a little fuzzy or hazy, but just perspective wise, based on experience. Kind of.
Well, I would just add to, I'll take a swing at that question. I would add, I really like what you're advocating for, David, sort of starting small. I think if you're an organization adopting the technology, figuring out what the technology is on like low-hanging fruit is a great way to kind of cut your teeth. You can figure out maybe how to evaluate different use cases, maybe build different data pipelines. Maybe you need a RAG system. Maybe it's figuring out how to get your data from one system over to a RAG system. Like, you could do all those things on low-hanging fruit or like these really small use cases. And I think that's a great way for organizations to mature, analytically speaking. I would also say, and maybe this was Sean's point, Don't fall in love with your first idea, because it's usually, your shittiest idea. So it might be, it might be great to cut your teeth and build those data pipelines and overall like build your maturation from an organizational perspective. But it's probably also not going to be like long term the best idea you've ever had. As it relates to future, these are the questions I always get a little nervous about. I think what we're seeing right now is part of the reason why people are struggling to identify revenue is because the technology is general purpose. And so organizations are just figuring out how to use that technology. In many cases, they're figuring out, well, to use the technology, I need to have complementary technologies. So now I've got to figure out RAG, or I've got to figure out some other technology that is required. So I could even build a product with the technology. So all of that is slow, it's incremental. And so I think what you're seeing now is, the early days of the internet, many of the early ideas of the internet were just things that existed in the real world. And they're like, well, we're going to bring it online. And that was like the big idea. And those are what I would kind of characterize as skeuomorphic ideas. You're looking for some sort of existing kind of analogy. And I think that's what you're seeing with the technology today. Copilot is skeuomorphic technology, right? Like, we know software developers exist, so we're going to create a Copilot for software development. And I think you're going to see that kind of like model replicated for almost every job. You're going to have them for security analysts. You're going to have them for your sales executive. You're going to have it for marketers. You're going to have it in the legal team. I think you'll probably see that expanded to security teams, to legal teams, to marketing teams, where maybe you have a bunch of language models, maybe it's agents working sort of collaboratively, but in like a team dynamic. So like security analysts, well, you don't have just security analysts. You might have threat intelligence analysts. You might have a CISO. You might have a compliance officer, and you might have language models kind of replicating that skeuomorphic idea of like team dynamics. Beyond that, I think is where it gets really interesting. I think that's where you're going to see kind of like, now we understand the technology and how it works. We've built up a bunch of complementary technologies so we could build products with these technologies easier. And I think then you'll see people who start thinking about the technology not in like a skeuomorphic sense, not in like in through analogy or through some real world metaphor, but they're going to think about how to use the technology natively. That complements the technology most, and I think that's where you're going to see the revenue come. You'll see it in those early, I think, preliminary stages. But I think once we break out of this skeuomorphic mold of like, oh, we're going to have a Copilot for everyone in our organization, we're going to start thinking about, well, maybe we could use them in these more novel ways that I think are going to have much more value long term.
I think people watching this that are super advanced are probably already going in this road. But from what I'm seeing and talking, and Sean seeing, and even both he and I are seeing out there in the industry, although nobody's coined it as such. If you took the medical field and how you have specialists, I have a love-hate relationship with this, but in any event, you get a sniffle, you go to see the ears, nose, and throat. You got a headache, I don't know, you go see the neurologist because maybe there's some cranial issues. You got this, you go see the specialist for that. My point in that is that a lot of the knowledge of these LLMs, I see them becoming very deep into their domain knowledge experts of whatever. And you can see this now from an architecture perspective. You have companies dealing with agent and agent orchestrations. For those out there listening to know anything about maybe even Docker container, Kubernetes, where this hub controls all these little endpoints. Those endpoints are these specialized large language models. So if you think of that in context of a business organization, you've got HR, you've got finance, you've got all the departments. If you've got domain knowledge of LLMs for each area within your business, and in an orchestration AI agent layer to kind of orchestrate the knowledge between each of those, it reduces hallucination, increases productivity, And I think a lot of companies are going this route because I've seen this architecture exist out there for a little while. Have you guys witnessed or seen anything like that in the areas of either people you've talked to, folks that you've interviewed, the research that you've done in the book? Have you run across anything like that? Because Sean and I have seen a little bit of it, but there's not a lot of public speaking about it for sure.
You're talking about the agent architectures?
Yeah, the agent architecture, and even just focusing on specific LLM deep knowledge of subject matter experts, whether it's departmental or just one LLM just designed for one thing and only one thing, as opposed to this, which is kind of an oxymoron, because a large language model, hence the word large.
A small language model.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Essentially.
A domain-specific language model.
Right. Yeah. I mean, to some, I mean, I don't think you'd ever want a purely domain, because I mean, in some ways, the advances we've seen over the last, let's say, 5 years is the result of thinking more broadly about the technology. Like NLP, natural language processing, has been concerned, historically speaking, with domain-specific knowledge. And so you've had like these very small boutique data sets, and that to some degree constrains the performance of models. So I'm a little suspicious that there are going to be like domain-specific models. Because you kind of want the model, you want certainly that domain-specific kind of orientation of a model for specific use cases, but you also want it to fit into a more general model. So like the models being trained on the internet give them like foundational knowledge for better interpretation of any narrow interpretation, like any narrowly interpreted problem. But I certainly like I understand what you're talking about. Like you're going to want these models a little more directed. I think I think we're already seeing that. I think prompt engineering is predicated on that idea.
Yep.
Like we want to constrain a model to a specific problem, but still benefit from kind of this broad understanding of the world. And I'm sort of like throwing in the air quotes because the models obviously don't understand the world. But that general knowledge kind of helps the performance in any narrow domain. I think you're going to see that, and I think you'll probably see that specifically in the open source domain.
And ironically, it's happening now anyway with RAG. People are building that. They're taking general purchase models, and then they're supplementing some domain-specific knowledge on top of that for maybe a chatbot for customer service, and it's geared towards some specific.
Or just layering on top of a BERT. It depends upon, like, again, I think there's an opportunity of AI in generative AI world at the edge, certainly from a security and privacy perspective. Microsoft and Apple are starting to put it into their products, but point of sale devices, advertising on the side of the road, things like that. It's raining today, so hey, maybe we should focus on these advertisements. There's the point I always like to make is I always like to predict the future by looking into the past. And to me, generative AI, and maybe it's a weird take, but I see generative AI very close to cloud computing. It came on the screen, the scene, and said, hey, we're going to be able to save you 30, 40%. And then, after the first year, they're like, wait a second, we spent more money going to the cloud than we saved. What's up with this? And then the simple fact of it all is cloud and Gen AI is really good at creating value first, savings next, and maybe even delight before savings. Savings may be the last thing that you get from generative AI. But I think we're at the top of the inflated expectations. And I think a lot of people are seeing quality and realization issues with business value. I think the future of Gen AI is going to be, how can I actually make business value and get promotions by using it, right? And promoting its use in the business.
Yeah, I agree.
I have seen your business model sort of, at least organizations striving towards it, particularly in the consulting world, with some clients who are basically trying to take their disparate consulting units, and AI that knowledge to try and find crossover opportunities and whatnot. Interestingly, what the holdup I keep seeing though is just human protection over those little fiefdoms and that data, and not wanting to share it, because where does that to your point, where does that revenue track? Am I getting promoted, or is it the guy in the next business unit? Does it help him more than me? I'll cooperate, I won't. So there's a big human element, I think, to actually effectuating that. But I have seen it. It seems that's a logical place organizations are trying to go.
Yeah. I say any business solution consists of people, process, and tools in that order. The technology is the easiest part.
Right.
If you could change the process, you're halfway there. Changing people's minds is a lot easier. It's a lot more difficult than changing the technology. So, your Clayton's perspective of being people first and being people intentional, and communicating those intentions, I think will solve a lot of the problems that clients have.
Yep, for sure. So, Rich and or Clayton, where can people find you if they're interested in finding out more information? Besides LinkedIn, I'm assuming.
At home.
Hey, everybody, we're having a party at Rich's house tonight.
Rich has still got some young ones, so he's at home.
Yeah. I hope you didn't hear. I heard one of them crying.
I heard it.
Oh, you did? Sorry about that. My apologies. Yeah, don't come to my house. It's a zoo. Yeah, LinkedIn, I would say, will certainly be promoting the book over the next couple of weeks. Use the book website, although the links aren't active today. But we will be signaling the book's availability on LinkedIn. So I would encourage you to go to LinkedIn.
I'd say that's the best place for me as well.
Yeah.
Nice.
And please reach out, join the conversation.
For sure.
Yes.
Yeah, slide into our DMs.
Yeah.
And
so,
absolutely. It seems to work, right, Clayton?
You sound so old when you say that. I love it.
The kids aren't saying that anymore.
Yes, it works occasionally. I don't know what the kids are saying, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, I can't keep up.
I can't either.
So just as a reminder for everybody listening, this is being live streamed and it will be available on LinkedIn. So join the conversation there in the comments section, ask questions. Any one of us will be happy to answer your questions. And then from there, it'll be a really quick hop, skip, and a jump over to any of our profiles where you can probably reach out, connect to us, and ask for more information. But I do appreciate having you guys on the show today. Thanks as always, Sean, for co-sponsoring the show. We do live stream every Wednesday. So if you want to come and connect and join us, please feel free to do so. It's, again, every Wednesday at 12 o'clock noon Eastern Standard Time. That's it for this episode. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Rich. Thanks, Clayton.
Thanks,
You guys.